It's not very often we have the chance to welcome the Chief of Staff of our Air Force to the ACSC stage, but today is one of those rare occasions. General David L. Goldfein received his commission from the U.S. Air Force Academy in 1983. He is a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Weapons School and is a command pilot with more than 4,200 flying hours in the T-37, T-38, F-16, F-117, the MQ-9, and the MC-12. He has flown combat missions in Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Allied Force, and Enduring Freedom. As the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force, General Goldfein serves as the senior uniformed Air Force officer responsible for the organization, training, and equipping of 660,000 active duty Guard, Reserve, and civilian forces serving in the United States and overseas. As a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the General and other service chiefs function as military advisors to the Secretary of Defense, National Security Council, and the President. I'm honored to have this opportunity to hear from this highly regarded Air Force leader, as I'm sure you are. Please stand with me to welcome to the ACSC stage the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Goldfein.
Hey, thanks so much. Hey, everybody, please take your seats. Thanks. And it's great to see you all. Congratulations to all of you, not only our U.S. but joint international partners as well. So now you're here in January, so you're starting to see the end coming, right? A little over halfway through the course. And I have a chance to talk to, I think, came and talked with you early in your tenure and early in my tenure as chief. And so I'm happy to report to you on sort of how we're doing on some of the things I laid out for you. But what I want to do is perhaps offer you a little bit of perspective. And so what I want to do today is actually not focus on my role as the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, but perhaps command. Because at the time of this painting, they actually know that the war is about to end. They've had Lee's troops under siege, and so now they're talking about what comes after as they offer best military advice to our Commander-in-Chief. And one could argue in our history as Americans, this is a time when we actually got it right. And while the faces and the locations may have changed, the process of giving our civilian leaders best military advice actually hasn't changed that much over the years. Next slide. So here we are just a week ago with our new Secretary of Defense, offering him best military advice, getting guidance and commander's intent from our Secretary of Defense. And so it's important for us to think about how we do this, because the reality of our history as Americans is there are times in our history where we actually didn't get this right. and I want to share one with you just as a case study. Next slide. This is a great picture. These are the Joint Chiefs, and they were summoned by President Kennedy to the cabinet room 1 month after the Bay of Pigs. And the president actually read them a speech, and I'm going to share a portion of it with you. And I want to put you in the mind of the Joint Chiefs. Now, by the way, having been in this room, and for some of you who have been in this room, there's only one difference today from the cabinet room in this picture and the cabinet room today, and that's the ashtrays are gone. Everything else looks about the same. So I want you to think about the Bay of Pigs, right? Remember our history. This was when it was an operation that was actually designed by the CIA, executed by the CIA, right? You had a relatively new president. This ought to resonate. You had a relatively new young president, right? And like how often happens in this town, he didn't have his entire cabinet in place. He didn't have a lot of his positions in place. He was just 1 month into the job, and he had this operation that had already been cooked up, right, and laid out in front of him, and he approved the operation, and they went forward, and of course it was an unmitigated disaster. So he summons his Joint Chiefs. And I now want you to put yourself in this room, and you're a member of the Joint Chiefs. And what I want to do is I want to read you a portion of the speech that the president delivered on this day when this picture was taken. And I won't do this with my Boston accent, but you all can imagine what it must have felt like. He said, now a few words about the Cuban affair. I view this failure as one involving all of us, and now want only to improve our ways of doing business in the future. With that introduction, I must say frankly that I do not think that the Joint Chiefs gave me the support to which the President is entitled. My impression is that as a body, you did not study the plan with the thoroughness which so important a matter deserved. Had you done so, I believe that you would have discovered, and I hope called to my attention, such matters as the marginal features of the air plan, the improbability of the guerrilla alternative, the looseness of the control over the invasion shipping, and the military disadvantages of running the operation out of Washington, D.C. While the CIA was in charge of it, I would say that you should have been continuously scrutinizing the military soundness of their plan and advising them and me as to your views. The record as I know it does not show this kind of watchfulness. So I share that with you because this is a case study that we all ought to think about. Words matter. If you actually go back and take a look at some of the transcripts that were taken of meetings that occurred in the tank years ago when we were talking about the first plan of going into Iraq, there's actually some documented evidence that the Joint Chiefs at the time thought that there was upwards of a 30% chance of success of the overall operation. That got translated through the national security apparatus as a fair chance of success. Now you got to think about that. Words matter, right? So if the President of the United States is contemplating something and he's thinking that there may be a 70% chance of failure, that's a little bit different than saying there's a fair chance of success. So how we speak truth to power matters. How we articulate best military advice matters. And understanding the environment that we're thinking and operating in and the various voices and worldviews in the room matters. Next slide. So in 2014, our world changed. I used to track, as the director of the Joint Staff, working for Chairman Dempsey, what particular kinds of meetings that I would prepare him for in the Oval Office or at the NSC, at the National Security Council. And at the time frame that we were there together, it was about an 80-20 split. 80% violent extremism in the Middle East, 20% rest of the globe. In 2014, the world changed. Russia went into Crimea. And we may look back on that now and think it may not be as big a deal, but I will tell you, having gone through it, and many of you in this room were involved in this, we actually didn't know whether we were facing the plague of the 21st century. We didn't know where that was going. So the reality is, we shifted from an 80-20 split, violent extremism in the Middle East within 20% of the rest of the globe, to a much more balanced view of the global challenges we face. And now you hear others talking about it, and as the Joint Chiefs, we look at the world through a lens we call the 4+1 lens of global challenges, which is China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and violent extremism as a condition that extends actually from the Philippines to Nigeria and everywhere in between, all the undergoverned spaces in between. So now we're having a much more balanced discussion about the global challenges we face. And there's some attributes associated with these global challenges that we as a joint force and as a coalition force have got to think through. Most of the challenges I described, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, violent extremism, are trans-regional in nature. Doggone it, our enemies are not paying attention to our combatant commander maps. Russia is actually not a EUCOM challenge. Russia is a EUCOM, PACOM, CENTCOM, SOUTHCOM, AFRICOM, NORTHCOM, TRANSCOM, STRATCOM challenge. And active in all of those areas. And the solution to these challenges have got to be trans-regional in nature. So there's a different global challenge that we face in terms of the national security challenges we face. This is now back to peer-on-peer, state-on-state activity with countries that actually can pose, if we mishandle it, an existential threat. So how we manage these challenges, how we think about these challenges, how we offer best military advice on how we can use the military instrument of power and insert it and connect it to the other elements of national power has become even more important in terms of how we, as graduates, think about the business of offering best military advice. And you got to understand, we all have to understand that there are different worldviews at play in every dialogue. We can't fall into the trap of assuming that everybody thinks like us. Next slide. So this is an interesting chart that shows relative investment from 2001 to 2016 of our allies, adversaries, and our partners, right? So you take a look at this and you see that what you should see is the growth in the PRC, in Russia, right? We all know this, you've been studying this, right? They've not been silent, they've been watching the way we operate, they've been watching what asymmetric advantages we have. They've been looking for ways that they can counter those asymmetric advantages and take those away from us, right? In terms of how we operate. But the question is, what's your worldview? Fear or fear not? So I would argue that for most who raise their hands and most who have been involved in supporting the fight downrange are clearly in the center of the fear camp. And here's how the fear camp works. This is as unstable as the world has been since probably the late 60s. As the director of the Joint Staff, I asked the historian, because it seemed like we were managing a lot of simultaneous challenges as a Joint Staff. I said, hey, go back and, good to see you. I said, go back and tell me, I said, when was the last time that we actually were managing this many global challenges at the same time, internationally? And the historian came back and said, 1968. That was the last time, between 1968 and 2014, that I just described for you, where we as a Joint Staff were actually managing this many global challenges that are of trans-regional nature. I said, all right, so let's see, 1968, what was that? Well, let's see, there was an assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, assassination of Robert Kennedy, you had the USS Pueblo, you had race riots across the country with civil rights going on, you had the campaigns across our campuses with Vietnam raging at the time. 1968 was a pretty busy year. The next busiest year was 2014. This is the last time, given the challenges that we face, the global challenges that are on the horizon, the stretching of our military, the amount of deploying we're doing, this is not the time for us to take risk with the military instrument of power. We ought to fear what's out there and act appropriately. That sounds reasonable, right? Because we've been in this fight now together now for 15 years, 25, 26 years, depending on how you look at it. So here's the fear not. And here's what reason I share this with you, because sometimes we are guilty of talking to individuals in the uniformed military as though everybody sees the world the same way we do, and that's just not the case. Because you can argue this one round or flat. So here's the fear not crowd. As tragic as the loss of life has been over the last 15 years, we can point back at times in our recent history where we lost more soldiers, sailors, and airmen and Marines in a single day of conflict than we've lost in the last 15 years. If you look at the demographics of what actually you measure nations against each other, the United States actually leads in terms of investment by 10 times in most of those major areas. Whether you want to talk about investment in the military, whether you want to talk about just the overall global economy, whether you want to talk about patents and innovation and research and development and schools and major educational institutions. I mean, you can go through any demographic list that you want to go through, and there's nobody that's even close. And so as tragic as the loss of life has been as we manage these global challenges over the last 15 years, the next 15, we're in the interwar period. And if you're in the interwar period, what you focus on the next fight that's coming, leader development, which is what you're doing here. And if there was ever a time for us as a nation with no existential threat on the horizon that's pressuring our way of life, if there was ever a time to take risk in the United States military, it's right now. And because empires over history actually fail first economically and then militarily, let's use this interwar period to get our economic house in order so that we can remain strong and we can afford the defense that we need for the future, because now is a reasonable time to take risk. To most of us in this room, that doesn't sound, we can't align with that. I share that with you because both of these worldviews are in every dialogue you're going to have when you start talking at the business of national security. Understand that there's different cultures in the room. Next slide. Everyone seated around that table brings to the table a culture that's unique and different. In the United States military, I could walk through our individual service cultures, but quite frankly, we're all more alike than we are different. I mean, here's the way we tend to approach a problem, right? it'll be the site of the important as every course that team.